Once again, we'd like to turn to Genesis 26. We've already read verses 1 through 6, and we'll not read that now, but we do want to read verses 12 through 22. Again, Isaac is in Gerar. Then Isaac sowed in that land and received in the same year 100-fold. And the Lord blessed him. And the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great. For he had possession of flocks and possession of herds and great store of servants. And the Philistines envied him. For all the wells which his father's servants had digged in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. And Abimelech said unto Isaac, Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we. And Isaac departed thence, pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, and dwelt there. And Isaac digged again the wells of water, which they had digged in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them after the death of Abraham. And he called their names after the names by which his father had called them. And Isaac's servants digged in the valley, found there a well of springing water. And the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, The water is ours, and called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him. And they digged another well, and strove for that also, and he called the name of it Sitnah. And he removed from thence and digged another well. And for that they strove not. And he called the name of it Rehoboth. And he said, For now the Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. Again, in verses 1 through 6, Isaac arrives in Gerar. He does this to escape the famine that was in the land. Again, it was his desire, it was his plan to go down to Egypt. But on his way to Egypt, while in Gerar, God tells him to take up temporary residence there. So God has placed him in Gerar. Contrary to Isaac's desire, contrary to Isaac's plan. But even so, Isaac sowed in that land. Again, sow spiritual seed where God has put you. And the Lord blessed him. And as a result, Isaac flourished in Gerar. And that is our opportunity. When God interrupts our desires and plans, to flourish where God has put us. Verse 15, we read of wells in Gerar. In verse 16, Abimelech tells Isaac to leave. And in verse 17, he pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. And in verse 18, Isaac digged again the wells of water. And in verse 19, and found there a well of springing water. And in verse 20, the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, The water is ours. And in verse 21, and they digged another well. And again in verse 22, and digged another well. And Isaac in verse 22 named it Rehoboth, saying, The Lord hath made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. So though Gerar was not Isaac's desire, was not Isaac's plan, God placed him there, and God had wells in Gerar. And though Gerar was famine-stricken, and the place of the Philistines, God had wells in Gerar. And though Gerar was a place of distress and trouble, inconvenience and need, God had wells in Gerar. Our subject is wells of water in Gerar. Isaac, as we mentioned this morning, is a type of a child of God. Begins with his birth. He's a miracle son. He's a miracle son. His birth was the expression of God's miraculous power. So it is with you and I that are saved. We're miracles of God. As children of God, we are His workmanship. We are the result of the work, the activity, and the energy of God's amazing grace and power. And all the life that we can live, being the miraculous children of God. Also, in the biblical record of Isaac, he was spared death through God's provided lamb. So it is with you and I, the saved, and all the life that we can live. Also, we see he is the son and he is the heir of Abraham. And such, of course, is a type of our sonship and our heirship. We read in Genesis 24:36 concerning Abraham's act toward Isaac, unto him hath he given all that he hath. And in chapter 25 and verse 5, and Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac. It's a picture of God, the child of God as a possessor of the riches of God and all the life that we can live. Isaac was a man who enjoyed the wealth of his father. So we are a people that ought to enjoy the wealth of our God. Genesis 26:3, the Lord tells Isaac, I'll be with thee and will bless thee. Again, the reason, because Abraham. Because Abraham. Isaac had the blessed promise of God because of the obedience of another. And so it is with you and I, the saved. Isaac was a man of privilege and opportunity because of the obedience of another. And all the privilege and the opportunity that you and I have, not because of ourselves, but because of Christ and all the life that we can live. We see also that Isaac was a pilgrim, and so it is with you and I. Just strangers and pilgrims passing through the world on our way home. And sometimes we have to pass through, we have to reside a while in Gerar. In Gerar. These are traveling days. Our life here on this earth, there can be difficult terrain. Through God's provided lamb in our place, we are heirs of God, made rich of God, blessed with the promise of God through the obedience of Jesus Christ. We see also that Isaac was a man of trial and conflict and struggle. And we see this particularly here in Genesis 26. So once again, we want to look at Isaac in Gerar. There he is. God guided him. God protected him. God provided for him. And God blessed him abundantly in Gerar. Prior to Isaac, his father Abraham had dug wells in Gerar. Back in Genesis chapter 20, and verse 1, and Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. Notice verse 14 and 15. And Abimelech took sheep, oxen, men servants, and women servants, and gave them unto Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee. Dwell where it pleaseth thee. And I believe it was at that time that Abraham dug these wells. In Gerar and also in the valley of Gerar. So he dug wells in the region, in the surrounding area of Gerar. Now in Bible times, when people dug wells, it was a statement of ownership of the land. It was title to the land. A well on a piece of land signaled to all, this land belongs to someone else. Wells, of course, speak of fountains of water. Water that was absolutely necessary to maintain life and for the well-being of life. So a well was a place of life, a place of strength, a place of refreshment. And when Isaac arrives in Gerar, though it's not where he wants to be, he's on his way to Egypt, there are wells there for him, already dug. And Isaac made use of the wells that his father Abraham had dug. And it was from these wells that Isaac was able to water his crops and his flocks and his herds and his entire household. Family and servants enjoyed the benefit of the wells that his father had dug. The Philistines, while in Gerar, became envious of Isaac's prosperity. And in verse 15 we read, For. In other words, the reason is going to follow. We see that they envied him, verse 14, for. And here's what they did. For the Philistines, the enemies of God and of God's people, had stopped them and filled them with earth. So the water in those wells is now obstructed. In verse 16, Abimelech orders Isaac to leave Gerar. Verse 17, he arrives in the valley of Gerar. And without a doubt, when Isaac arrived in that valley, he went to the spots where he knew that his father had previously dug wells. But when he got to those spots, he couldn't see the wells. The reason, verse 18, for the Philistines had stopped them after the death of Abraham. After Abraham died, those wells in the valley of Gerar, the Philistines filled with earth. So there's Isaac in the valley of Gerar with his family, his servants, his animals. They are in need of what is absolutely essential to their life and well-being. The water that they needed was still there. The water is still there. They couldn't see it. And in their present circumstances, it could not be obtained. They knew that there was water in those wells. That which they so desperately needed was in those wells. The problem was not that the water was no longer there. That's never the problem. Never. The problem was, Earth and rubbish filled the wells. Earth. The wells were covered with earth. So between them and the water is the problem. Earth. The water is there, but they're unable to put their vessels in and draw it. Down in the depths of those wells, the waters they need are there, but they're unable to get to it. Why? Earth is in the way. And you imagine how discouraging. They leave Gerar, the city of Gerar. They're now in the valley of Gerar. Isaac goes, I know there's a well right here. Dad dug it. I know there's a well right here. But they can't see it. It's been covered. Oh, the frustration that must have filled Isaac's heart. They go to the wells, knowing that the water that would sustain them, strengthen them, and refresh them is right there. But the wells are filled with earth. They're standing right where the wells are. But earth is in the way. And they cannot get to the water. Again, the problem's not, the water is not there. That's not the problem. The problem was earth-filled wells. In realizing the problem, we read in verse 18, and Isaac digged again the wells of water. Isaac said, get out your shovels. I know there's a well here. And Isaac digged again the wells of water. Notice what they did not do. They arrive at the spot where the well is. It's filled with earth. They did not throw up their hands and walk off in despair. That would have meant death. And it would have never got them the water they needed. Notice also that they did not focus upon who filled the wells with water. You can argue all day, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault. Guess what? That won't get you the water. They did not declare war on the Philistines. They needed water. Declaring war on the Philistines would not open the wells. So verse 18, Isaac digged again the wells of water. This was not random digging, but digging in a specific spot where he knew the water was. And digging with a specific purpose to obtain the water that he knew was there. So Isaac digged again the wells of water. They removed the earth, the clutter, the rubbish that was between them and the much needed water. The result, verse 19, and Isaac's servants digged in the valley and found there a well of springing water. So there they are digging, and water came gushing and vaulting from the ground. And now, in the place of disappointment and frustration, is euphoria. And need is now overflowed with abundance. They have gone from stopped up wells to a well of springing water. And then notice verse 20. And the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, The water is ours. And he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him. Esek means contention. In verse 21, they dug another well, and they called the name of it Sitnah, meaning hostility and accusation. Again, the well is ours. You stole it from us. Accusation. And in verse 22, again, all they've been doing is uncovering the wells. They named that third well Rehoboth, meaning room or space. What this teaches us is that Isaac knew the importance of the wells. And everywhere he went, he got the earth out of the way. And this regardless of the situation. Regardless of the situation, this is what he did. So let's make brief application. The spiritual application, of course, is very clear. The water that was in those wells was absolutely vital to their physical life. You can't live without water. It was absolutely vital to their strength, their comfort, their refreshment, their rejuvenation. The waters in those wells was invaluable to them. Couldn't put a price on it. And more importantly, for you and I, they're spiritual wells. These wells contain the water that is needed to maintain our spiritual health and well-being and the vigor of our spiritual life. Again, water is essential to life. It is purifying in its influence. It has refreshing and fertilizing capabilities. And it allows us to take in and appropriate our food for nourishment. And as this is so in physical life, so it is so in the spiritual life. There are spiritual wells containing spiritual water. We read in Isaiah 12, verse 2, Behold, God is my salvation, my strength, and my song. And then again he says, my salvation. And then we read in verse 3, Therefore, that is, because of who God is in relation to us, with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation. This is the wonderful opportunity of every child of God, to draw water out of the wells of salvation. Oh, the blessing of being able to draw water out of the wells of salvation. What are these wells of salvation? Well, I believe they speak of the enjoyment of the blessings of our salvation. To draw water out of the wells of salvation is to live in the enjoyment of spiritual blessings in heavenly places that we read of in Ephesians 1. To draw water out of the wells of salvation is to live in the enjoyment of adoption into the family of God. To live in the enjoyment of redemption and regeneration and reconciliation and forgiveness, etc. The enjoyment, it is the enjoyment of saved. Saved. But sadly, many who profess salvation are unable to draw from such. The water's still there. Hasn't gone anywhere. But earth and rubbish has filled the well. These wells of salvation speak of that which is needed to maintain our spiritual health, well-being, and the vigor of our spiritual life. They speak of the glorious possibilities of spiritual life. The wells of salvation speak of spiritual strength, comfort, refreshment, peace, assurance, and victory. The wells of salvation are God's provision for us. Again, the wells were there when Isaac got there. There are the wells of salvation provided by God in the midst of urgent need. And these are filled with the spiritual resources that we need. The wells are still there. God's placed you somewhere. There's wells there. There's wells there. You got to get to those wells. The problem here wasn't that the wells had gone dry. The wells of salvation never go dry. Those are eternal blessings. The problem wasn't that the wells went dry. The problem is earth filled the wells. So there's no need to seek other wells because the well's right there. You don't have to seek another well. That's what they did in Jeremiah. Jesus Christ, the promises of God, the treasures of God's Word, the unsearchable riches of Jesus Christ, the grace that is through Him are the water that we need. We need to drink of that water. And many times we are unable to appropriate these. It's not that the promises of God are null and void. It's not that the unsearchable riches of Christ have run out. It's not that the treasures of God's Word have been emptied. But earth gets between us and the wells. Earth gets between us and God all the time. I doubt there's a day that goes by that earth, to some degree, does not get in the way between us and God. And this is a very serious dilemma for Isaac and his servants and his family. The spiritual wells are where they've always been. It's where they've always been. You don't have to look somewhere else. And they are as full as they've always been. But sometimes earth gets in the way. Just like Isaac and his people. The wells are there, but earth prevented them from access. And they could not apply the water to their lives. It's all the clutter. It's all the rubbish that keeps God's people from making use of the water. Again, we read verse 15, concerning the wells in the city of Gerar, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. Oh, what we fill our lives with. And then verse 18, concerning the wells of the valley of Gerar, the Philistines had stopped them. This is the work of an enemy. It's the work of an enemy. Anyone who throws earth in the wells that God has made available in your life is doing the work of an enemy. That's not a friend. That's an enemy. I don't care who it is. That's an enemy. If we ourselves cast earth upon the wells of God's providing, we oppose ourselves. We become our own enemy. We live in opposition to ourselves. If you think about it, many spend their day shovelful after shovelful filling the well with earth and clutter and rubbish. But just as in Isaac's case, there was need to dig. There was no need to dig randomly in the desert. You don't need to do that. You don't need to just randomly go digging in the desert. You know where the wells are. This book is one of them. You know where it is. You know where it is. Draw water out of that well. No need to dig randomly. Just as in Isaac's case, there was a need to break out the shovels and remove the earth. Don't take the shovels and fill the wells. Take the shovel and remove the earth. And we need to do that every day. And so they dug and dug and dug. And guess what? They found a well of springing water. We as God's people find ourselves in many valleys of Gerar. Places where the enemy is at work. But mark it down. There's a well at hand. Think of Hagar. There's a well at hand. It's right there. It's right there. And God opened her eyes. There's a well at hand, filled with that which will strengthen and comfort and refresh. There are wells of God's providing. And we can with joy draw water out of the wells of salvation. Oh, to live in the overflow of springing spiritual water. We ask the question, do we live our lives? And I realize we all have frustrating moments. That's not what I'm talking about. But overall, our lives lived in frustration and emptiness because of stopped up wells? Or overall, do we live our lives in the blessing and abundance of springing water? Which describes our life? And again, I'm not talking about just situations. I'm talking about overall life. Where do we live our life? Stopped up wells or springing water? Even in Gerar, you can experience springing water. You don't have to get out of Gerar. That's where God's placed you. That's where you need to be. And there are wells there. There's wells there. Wherever God places, there are wells there. We need to make use of those wells. Brother Stephen, if you'll come.